Friday, July 5th, 1985 marked a significant day for Father Niall Molloy. Having sought advice yet again from his solicitors, he faced the inevitable but difficult task of withdrawing all financial aid from his best friends, Richard and Therese Flynn. Complications from a failed land sale heightened his unease, casting a shadow over the upcoming weekend of celebrations in the Flynn household, saying to one of his friends and parishioners, Johnny Gallagher, "I'm really not looking forward to this weekend," and saying, "I just want to be my own person, and at the moment, I'm not." Following Father Niall's murder, despite a confession, no conviction was secured, raising questions about the authenticity of this confession in this mysterious story filled with enigma and perplexing twists. It's a difficult one to hear, and there are some descriptive details of injuries that some people may find disturbing. I don't mean to insult or disrespect anyone I speak about here. All I have done is gathered the information in the public domain from books, documentaries, interviews, court documents, the Father Molloy website, and brought it all together to deliver it here to you. Many people believe this is a cover-up, a miscarriage of justice. I'd like to know what you think. My name is Louise. You're welcome to A Drop in the Ocean, or welcome back, and let's dive in. To provide some context, let's rewind just a little, because Father Niall Molloy was a beloved priest in Castlecoot parish. At the time of his untimely death, he had been battling some personal and financial problems. Born into a well-off, horse-loving family in County Roscommon, Niall inherited a passion for horses. He was a passionate and competent show jumper, winning numerous prizes from the age of 14. He was ordained in Rome in 1957, causing huge celebrations at his home in County Roscommon, making media headlines. Following this, he served in various parishes and as an army chaplain, and he was deployed overseas in Cyprus, but always loved and respected no matter where he went, and he never abandoned his love for horses. Niall's parishioners adored him, describing him as gentle, friendly, easygoing, always approachable, and always smiling. He was the type of priest who would drop in for a cup of tea and a chat. He was loved by all ages, with not one single person having a bad word to say about him. I genuinely could not find one negative comment about Father Niall, either at the time of his death or afterwards. Gentle is the word most commonly used to describe Father Niall. His father, William J. Molloy, was a successful businessman and gifted him £60,000 before passing away in 1965. Now, this is a substantial amount of money, especially at the time, equivalent in today's terms to be around €400,000, or so I'm told. Niall wisely invested some of this in his passion for horses to secure a more than comfortable retirement fund. Father Niall earned a great reputation in the equestrian community. His close friendship, first with Therese through the horses, but then later when she married, also with Richard, involved a joint business involving thoroughbred horses, land and cattle between Therese Flynn and Father Niall, with Niall being financer along with his expertise in horses. Despite their downsizing to Kilcorsey House in 1981, a trophy house including stables, a courtyard, and surrounding lands formerly belonging to their friends the Goodbodies, the Flynn's financial troubles persisted. Richard Flynn proposed a plan involving Father Niall and Therese buying the surrounding lands at Kilcorsey. This would alleviate financial pressure from Richard, but would keep the land in Therese's name. However, despite a paid deposit, the Irish Land Commission's refusal led to Therese Flynn owing Niall his half of the deposit back, which was £11,000. It was Father Niall's solicitor that informed him that this sale had been disapproved. However, Niall was finding it impossible to retrieve this deposit from the Flynns. This led him to speak with his solicitor on a number of occasions, but the final conversation took place discussing how all financial ties would be severed with the Flynns the coming weekend, the weekend of the wedding. So while the Flynns prepared for their eldest daughter's wedding on the Saturday, July 6th, Father Molloy committed to his parochial duties as always. He was marrying a local couple in his own parish, which was only an hour away, so he joined them later in the evening for a short while. The wedding was attended by highly influential figures, such as the former Taoiseach, the Deputy Prime Minister or Vice Taoiseach Brian Lenihan Sr., a high-ranking Fianna Fáil politician, along with other politicians. This wedding was a spectacle, held in a large marquee set up on the grounds of Kilcorsey House. Following a wedding lunch, the second day of the wedding weekend, held in the same marquee with around 50 guests, many of whom had attended the day before, Father Molloy would find himself in a series of events that would alter his fate. Brutally beaten after a successful, extravagant, high-profile wedding, he was left dying for hours on a blood-stained bedroom floor in the Flynn family home. There are at least two narratives about why, how, where and when this tragedy occurred on July 7th, 1985, when Father Niall Molloy lost his life. The first one, the one that was gone with at the time, was as follows. The Flynns proposed that on that Sunday evening, following the wedding lunch, Richard, Therese and Father Niall went to their good friends, the Goodbodies, for drinks, returning around 9:30 to 9:45. The rest of the Flynn family allegedly were then in a pub visiting another friend in Clara, and they would not return to Kilcorsey until around 1 a.m. There was also an elderly aunt, May Flynn, who was in the house at this time, who went to bed at, I think it was 4 different times, depending on whose statement you read or who you believe, but allegedly slept through everything, didn't wake until the morning. Around midnight, Richard Flynn said he and Therese went to bed. Father Niall came in for a nightcap. Richard said a row broke out over who's going downstairs for the next drink. He said he was going down, but only to get a drink for himself. He wouldn't get one for Therese and Father Niall, who both lunged at him, attacking him physically. In defence, he said he punched his wife once and punched Father Niall twice, maybe 3 times. Richard said he then blacked out. The next thing he remembers is both his wife Therese and Father Niall unconscious on the bedroom floor. He splashed water on both their faces. Therese came round, Father Niall did not. That was Richard Flynn's account. Therese Flynn says she went upstairs by herself, went to bed and fell asleep by herself. She awoke at some point. Her husband was beside her in the bed. Father Niall was sitting on the bottom of the bed chatting. Then she blacked out. The next thing she remembers is coming round to Father Niall unconscious on the bedroom floor. She felt for a pulse, she couldn't find one, and she began trying to resuscitate him. She couldn't and wouldn't remember anything more. Father Dignan, the parish priest in Clara, received a phone call at approximately 1 a.m. So we're into Monday morning now. It was Richard Flynn calling, telling Father Dignan he needed to come to Kilcorsey House and to be prepared to anoint someone. Apparently he didn't say who needed to be anointed, and Father Dignan didn't ask. When Father Dignan arrived at Kilcorsey House, he gave Father Niall Molloy his last rites and said he didn't know at this point whether Father Niall was dead or alive. He said Father Niall was lying on his back on Richard and Therese's bedroom floor. He said he had a conversation around 10 minutes long with Richard Flynn, but enforced confessional privileges of confidentiality, so we've never known what was said in this conversation. Father Dignan said he tried, along with Richard Flynn, to contact a doctor, but he had forgotten his glasses, so he couldn't. He returned home at some point to fetch his glasses, where he also called the bishop. There was no attempt at this point to call Niall's family, an ambulance, the police, with Father Dignan later saying he wasn't aware of the 999 emergency service, which had been established 48 years prior. It was reportedly around this time the other members of the Flynn family came back to Kilcorsey House. There was a local doctor in Clara village, Dr. Corboy, but for an unknown reason, Father Dignan drove Richard Flynn's daughter Zandra to Kilbeggan, which was 10 kilometres away, making contact with Dr. O'Sullivan, where they had a conversation. Richard Flynn and Dr. O'Sullivan were friends, even having discussed going into business together. We don't know whether this actually came about or not. Father Dignan and Sandra at approximately 2 a.m. called Dr. O'Sullivan, informed by Father Dignan that Father Niall was deceased, and requested that he come to Kilcorsey House. He called an ambulance from his house. On arriving at Kilcorsey House, he was shown to the bedroom where he recognised Father Niall Molloy, lying on the floor. Dr. O'Sullivan examined Father Niall and found him to be deceased, but that his body was still warm. He said Therese Flynn was in a state of hysteria on the ground with a bruise on her face, being attended to by one of her daughters. This daughter was a qualified nurse. She had checked Father Niall for a pulse. She couldn't find one. She had closed his eyes and put a towel over his face, then turned her attention towards her mother. Dr. O'Sullivan gave Therese Flynn a sedative to calm her down. He stated that at this stage, Richard Flynn was sitting downstairs in the sitting room in his pyjamas. He said Richard Flynn told him the row had started downstairs and continued upstairs. Richard Flynn would later deny saying this. Dr. O'Sullivan then drove Therese to Tullamore General Hospital in his own car, along with one or two of the Flynn family, depending again on who you listen to. He had advised Father Dignan to notify the guardian Clara. Father Dignan went to fetch Sergeant Ford. This was about 3:15. Father Dignan told Sergeant Ford a priest was dead. He said he had banged his head on the wall. It was an accidental death. He said, "This is an awful scandal for the parish. Is there any way it can be kept quiet?" Sergeant Ford told him no, it would have to be investigated. Father Dignan told him he didn't know this priest, even though they had been seated together at the wedding the previous day. Sergeant Ford called his superior and immediately went to the Flynn's Kilcorsey house. On arriving at Kilcorsey house, Father Dignan met him at the door and brought him upstairs, telling him Father Niall had been dead a couple of hours. The scene that met Sergeant Ford upstairs in the master bedroom was the following. Father Niall was lying on his back behind the bedroom door. His face was bloodied with some obvious injuries visible, and there was froth coming from his mouth. There was a leaf caught under Father Niall's shirt collar, which Sergeant Ford believed indicated the assault had taken place outside. Father Niall was wearing an expensive gold watch, the face of which was broken and the hands were stopped. He was neatly dressed, nothing out of place, as if he had been laid out. There was an 8-foot long bloody drag mark across the bedroom floor, from just beside the bed to just short of where Father Niall was lying. There was blood on the wall, just above the body, and on the pictures on the wall, on the floor, both sides of the door, in the washroom, and on the banister coming up the stairs. Sergeant Ford then went downstairs, where he spoke with Richard Flynn, who he knew. Therese wasn't there for him to speak to, as she had already been brought to Tullamore Hospital. Richard told Sergeant Ford, "It's a messy old business," referring to the scene upstairs. He apologised for bringing him out so late and asked him would he like a cup of coffee. Sergeant Ford said Richard was his usual self. He was relaxed, not very concerned. He sat on the sofa drinking a cup of coffee with one arm thrown over the back of the sofa, telling Sergeant Ford, "I'm the culprit," that he was taking the blame, showing Sergeant Ford his fist. Sergeant Ford didn't see any marks on Richard's fists, and Richard said he was taking full responsibility, with Sergeant Ford later saying it looked like it was all arranged. It was he was taking the blame and that was it. Richard Flynn told Sergeant Ford, "About midnight, my wife and I went to bed and Father Molloy came into our bedroom. We were all having a drink and a discussion. An argument developed between the three of us. It was a stupid argument over who would go downstairs to get another drink. I refused to get a drink for my wife and Father Molloy. They both attacked me then, physically, and I struck them with my fists. I hit my wife once in the face and she fell down. I hit Father Molloy at least twice and probably 3 times in the face. Both my wife and Father Molloy were rendered unconscious. I threw water on both their faces. My wife revived, but Father Molloy did not. I ran downstairs to phone the parish priest, Father Dignan. I went back upstairs and my wife Therese, she was in hysterics. I examined Father Molloy and he was dead." Sergeant Ford said that seeing so much blood around the place, it would stick in your mind. And then the big track from the bed down to the door, all blood. With him later saying Richard Flynn took full responsibility, but with further investigation it would appear to me that it was someone else. The Garda Technical Bureau took over the case within a few hours, so Sergeant Ford was no longer involved. Richard Flynn was charged with manslaughter and assault causing actual bodily harm. The trial would be eventually held in the Dublin Circuit Criminal Court in July the following year, following multiple adjournments in a country courthouse after many pre-trial hearings, with Richard Flynn entering a plea of not guilty on both counts. But everyone believed, with what evidence they had, that this was an open and shut case, that there would no doubt be justice for Father Niall Molloy. The trial would last less than 4 hours. It was only at the trial Father Niall's family or anyone else heard what Richard Flynn's account of what had taken place was. The prosecution called their witnesses, including key witness, state pathologist Dr. John Harbison, who had examined Father Niall at the scene and then had also carried out the autopsy. Examining Father Niall's remains, he found 6 external injuries, along with bruising to the legs and knees. There were no defensive or offensive injuries, concluding that the primary cause of Father Niall's death was the trauma to his brain arising from his head injuries. He also noted some degeneration of the heart. His blood contained alcohol, but showed he would not have been inebriated, drunk. He also found internal bleeding to the kidney. Richard Flynn's senior counsel, Patrick McEntee, would cross-examine state pathologist Dr. Harbison, putting it to him that he couldn't say it was impossible that Father Niall had died as a result of acute heart failure, not necessarily related to trauma. Dr. Harbison hesitantly replied that it could have been possible, but that he couldn't ignore the brain injury. Then Solicitor Patrick McEntee claimed Richard Flynn could not be charged with assault as he was acting in self-defence, and if perhaps Father Molloy had struck his head on a hard object when falling, then it's possible Richard hadn't used excessive force. Patrick McEntee then requested that the jury be removed so he could advance his case, with Judge Frank Rowe instructing them to leave the courtroom. When they were called back in, Judge Rowe directed them to find Richard Flynn not guilty on both counts. Richard Flynn walked away an innocent man, and the case was closed. Father Niall Molloy's family, friends, parishioners, and everyone were outraged, shocked, and simply could not believe this. Now, what I want you to do is take what I have just told you about the events on this fateful night and put them to one side. What we're going to go through now is what we know apart from those statements that were given or the ones that weren't, the evidence that was shown by the autopsy, and we'll discuss some other relevant details, all of which change everything about this case. We know Father Niall's bungalow was broken into a couple of months before this weekend, which was highly unusual, not only because it was extremely rare for a priest to be robbed, but also because only a heavy oak desk containing his paperwork was targeted and some paperwork stolen. There was also a small collection box on top of this desk from the previous Sunday's collection in Mass. This was taken, but it was found discarded in a nearby field, including the contents of it. In the months prior to Father Molloy's death, Therese Flynn took out a life insurance policy on Niall. A transaction apparently unbeknownst to him, as his bank records showed that he never paid any premiums on this policy. This insurance policy listed Therese Flynn as his sister, with Richard Flynn being his brother-in-law. There would be a claim made on this insurance policy 4 weeks following Father Niall's death, allegedly written by Therese Flynn, but with British handwriting expert Mike Ansell saying this note was not written by Therese Flynn, and furthermore saying that Father Niall's signature on the original policy didn't match to Father Niall's writing. This insurance claim was abandoned when asked by the insurance company for supporting documents. This has never been investigated. We also know that being a priest, and more so having been deployed overseas, Father Niall was obligated to have a will, which he said had been sent to his diocese. There was a belief that Father Niall had listed Therese Flynn as sole beneficiary to his estate on his will. Now, this was confirmed by Therese Flynn before her death. This will has never been found. The diocese, the church, say they have no record of such a will. Father Niall had a black eye before the wedding, which he alleged he received from a member of the Flynn family. Father Niall was planning on severing his ties with the Flynn family that day, the day he lost his life. Father Niall Molloy spoke with the Flynn's next door neighbour, Brian Sheridan's daughter, around 9 p.m. on that Sunday evening, at some time before the assault took place, while out on a horse and cart, which was common for him to do. Although even being a guest at the wedding and a next door neighbour, it would be 30 years before Brian Sheridan would ever be questioned regarding the events surrounding this weekend. Remembering the statements provided for the trial, Father Niall was said to be visiting the good bodies with Richard and Therese Flynn until 9:30, 9:45. So how could he have been speaking to someone at 9 p.m? We know that sometime after 9 p.m, Father Molloy was viciously attacked. His body was moved at least once, placed just behind the door in the Flynn's master bedroom, successfully causing a national and international media frenzy of rumours. Priest and bedroom in the same sentence is enough to do this, and the media ran with this. It absolutely grew legs and ran marathons, all these rumours. And it was great for a crime to get international attention, because that's often what's needed to get some justice. However, as soon as everyone realised there was no scandal, at least of a romantic nature, it was dropped, and it completely overshadowed the true crime here, that a man was killed, murdered, in his so-called friend's house, or at least premises. Instead, because the rumours were unfounded, it dissipated. The watch that Father Niall had on his wrist, the time on the watch was frozen at 10:40, and he subsequently died from head trauma. Actual time of death is unknown. This frozen wristwatch would be returned to Father Niall's family within 3 days, deeming it unusable as evidence, as it was now contaminated, as it had left police custody. There's also a lot of amnesia surrounding this time on that fateful night, with the bits allegedly being recalled not matching up. There was a lot of time lost. The first time anyone outside Kilcorsey House was contacted, that we are told of, is by way of a phone call made by Richard Flynn to Father Dignan, parish priest, asking him to come to Kilcorsey House to be prepared to announce someone, with Richard not saying who and Father Dignan not asking. Father Dignan arrived around 1 a.m, was shown upstairs to Father Niall. Father Dignan said he couldn't say whether Father Niall was dead or alive at this point, so he gave him his final rites. No one called 999 or Niall's family. Some people say Therese Flynn's brother-in-law, a doctor, actually a county surgeon from Kilkenny, was in the house when this happened. There was also a qualified nurse there. Father Niall received no medical assistance. 3 separate pathologists have stated if Father Niall had been taken to the hospital, there's a chance he could have been saved. Allegedly, people were told during this time, when this assault took place, to get out of the house, to get away from the house, while Father Niall lay unconscious, dying on the floor. Now, I say allegedly because the people who allegedly admitted this have never been willing to, or compelled to, testify to this. We know the Flynn's solicitor was called. We don't know the exact time, but we do know it was before 3:15 a.m. because the Gardaí said it didn't happen once they arrived, and the solicitor got to the house by 7:30 a.m, a few hours later, informing the investigating team the Flynns would not be speaking to anyone, that there would be a prepared statement from Richard later, which there wasn't. This same solicitor, Mr. Liam Lysack, had also represented Father Niall. He was the solicitor acting for the partnership involving Therese and Father Niall, and Father Niall had trusted him, saying he's a good Fine Gael man. But on being contacted by Father Niall's family regarding the administration of Father Niall's estate, Solicitor Liam Lysack blatantly denied the fact, even in writing. This would lead to Solicitor Liam Lysack being found guilty of professional misconduct. A local resident, Jerry North, who grew up with the Flynns, referring to them as the wealthy family in the parish, was told by a person who was there that night when this murder occurred, and who obviously can't be named, that there were 12 or 13 people in Kilcorsey House when Father Niall was attacked, not 4 people as portrayed at the time. Also, that it happened downstairs in the living room. Father Niall was hit over the head with a trophy, a statue of a horse. and his body moved upstairs afterwards and placed in the bedroom to insinuate something immoral going on. This person, who again claimed to be there, also informed Jerry North that days before this, on the previous Thursday, Father Niall had suffered an assault in the living room of Kilcorsey House, resulting in a coffee table breaking. This man told Jerry North that he was interviewed, but in the interview the Gardaí were nervous, that they basically gave him multiple choice options of what occurred. He repeated one of these choices back to them. They wrote this down as his statement. He was re-interviewed for the cold case review, which took place years later, but he reportedly said they really just talked about horses. Chit-chat. Father Niall's family had also been given this information, that the assault took place downstairs, and remember, initially Richard said this, with Father Niall's body being moved to the bedroom. The Molloy family were told this by way of an anonymous letter from someone who claimed to be working in the house that afternoon as a waiter. The cold case review couldn't identify the writer of this letter. The day after the murder, Father Niall's brother William, or Billy Molloy, spoke with Richard Flynn, where Richard Flynn told him, "I had a terrible lot of drink taken and a political row started," but Richard Flynn would later say he didn't recall saying this. Billy Molloy noticed during this conversation that Richard Flynn did have a hurt hand, with one finger in particular. It looked like it was possibly a fracture, with the hand swollen and with bloody knuckles. Richard Flynn was questioned by the guards, but his son insisted on being present during all questioning. In the following weeks, the Gardaí were made aware of the financial entanglements and the considerable debts owed to Niall by the Molloys, but this was never made part of the trial. In the weeks following Niall's death, his favourite horse, one he called his retirement horse, which was actually called Step Aside, was quickly sold off. Following Father Niall's death, Therese Flynn told the guards she had repaid Niall this deposit owed to him with cash, no receipts. She said she paid him from a safe in Kilcorsey House. However, the guards later established there was no safe in Kilcorsey House. The trial judge, Judge Rowe, knew both the Flynns, in fact was supposedly great friends with them, and also knew Father Niall. If that's the case, why would he have taken this case? A judge must be impartial. The inquest took place 5 weeks after the trial, with a jury. An inquest investigates and gives findings on cause of death. Father Niall's family sought new representation for the inquest with a degree of difficulty, as multiple solicitors wouldn't touch this case. Solicitor Ben O'Rafferty and his team would take the case. Their aim was to find that, going properly by the evidence provided by Dr. Harbison, Father Molloy died as a result of his head injuries. Previously protected by marital privileges, at the inquest, Therese Flynn did give evidence, but it was just to say she couldn't remember anything. Dr. Harbison reiterated he believed the cause of death to be injury to the brain, and that the evidence of heart disease was much less, stating, "Father Niall would be alive today if it were not for the brain swelling suffered as a result of the injury to the head." It took the jury less than 15 minutes to unanimously find Father Niall Molloy died as a result of brain swelling caused by multiple blows to the head. He was murdered. Outside the court, David Flynn, Richard and Therese's son, would give the only ever public comment by any of the Flynns regarding the case. Strangely saying, when asked by a reporter, did your family find it very difficult to handle the rumours and speculation surrounding this case, David's response was, extremely difficult. It's very difficult, maybe, when one knows certain answers and isn't in a position to comment. It makes it very difficult to live with. What do you think he meant by that statement? Father Niall's family already knew what this inquest confirmed. They had seen the autopsy. They had photographic evidence. There were 37, I believe, photographs of Father Molloy's injuries. A nurse on duty in Tullamore Hospital that night, when Father Molloy's body was admitted, said his injuries were horrific. And then the family also knew, following Father Niall's murder, as did law enforcement, of the highly likely financial motive for Father Niall's murder. Also, Father Niall was not a drinker. He would have one or two, but he would be pushed to have a third one. He would never fight someone over whose turn it is to go and get drinks. He also had a stomach ulcer, so he couldn't drink much. So he would take a glass of milk each night going to bed. And the night he was murdered, there was a glass of milk waiting for him in his own room, which he had in Kilcorsey House, on his bedside locker. He also had an office in Kilcorsey House. He basically lived there. The inquest, however, did not provide answers to the questions of inconsistencies, people not being forthcoming with the events of this night, including the number of people who allegedly witnessed Father Niall's murder, or the fact that the evidence and the testimony of what occurred that night, they simply don't match. But double jeopardy. The accused was a free man. We know Father Niall didn't have any defensive wounds or offensive wounds, so we know he didn't have a chance to protect himself, and he didn't attack anyone. Following the inquest, the Molloy family brought a civil action against Richard Flynn, which he didn't contest. This resulted in the Molloy family receiving a sum of money in damages from Richard Flynn. No one could deny the initial investigation that took place into Father Molloy's murder was lacking. There were blood samples taken, but not tested against people. The crime scene, although looked at with blood patterns being mapped, wasn't entered into evidence. The blood on the banister in the washroom, why was it there? Why was there a broken coffee table downstairs, where some people had said the assault actually took place? And why were the wedding guests not questioned, nor the next door neighbours? Why was there never any record of Therese Flynn's medical records from that night when she was admitted to Tullamore Hospital? Did she have injuries or did she not? Why was Father Niall's body moved? Why did Richard Flynn initially say to multiple people the row broke out downstairs, but then change it? And why wasn't any of this questioned? In 1988, Father Molloy's family requested the investigation be reopened as they had new evidence. Professor Dermot Hourihan, a professor of histopathology, which basically put is the study of bodily tissue, found that Father Niall had suffered kicks as well as punches. Kicks would explain 4 of the injuries sustained. 1 kick to his jaw, 1 to his back causing the internal bleeding of the kidney, 1 to his inner thigh, and 1 to his shoulder. These were indicative of being kicked while lying on the ground. Professor Hourihan also found Father Niall's injuries would have resulted in him being alive for hours rather than minutes following the assault, and agreed Father Niall died as a result of his head injuries with unconvincing evidence of underlying heart disease. Dr. John Dinn, a consultation neuropathologist, also agreed with the cause of death and that it would have taken time for these injuries to cause death, with Father Niall having been unconscious prior to death. In 2011, due to reports in the media regarding the case, a new inquiry was established to review the investigation. Father Niall's case had been again in the media and discussed in the Dáil, the Irish Parliament, with one TD having reviewed the documentation describing the cover-up as a mafia-style collusion between institutions of the state and the church. However, they only looked at Garda files relating to the case, nothing else. So, of course, nothing new came to light. And then we had the McGinn report. For this investigation under Irish law, again, they couldn't make anyone speak. You don't have to speak to the Gardaí here. Even Richard Flynn wasn't questioned, under doctor's orders. Also, forensic evidence and certain testimonies had disappeared. The blood samples had vanished. This investigation took 2 years. There were a lot of statements taken, but no conclusions reached, other than the conclusion that there were no new leads to advance the case. During the course of this investigation, it had been recommended to the investigative team by an investigative journalist that they needed to interview another 35 people. Either interview them for the first time or re-interview them had they spoken before, as they had not been forthcoming for whatever reason at the time of the initial investigation. But the team only spoke to 17 of these witnesses. Only 17 volunteered to speak with them. The remainder declined to speak with them. Legally, again, in Ireland, they didn't have to. David Flynn, son of Richard and Therese, spoke with them. From this conversation, the McGinn report in part states, while David Flynn accepted that his relationship with his mother had changed after 1985, he denied that his mother had ceased speaking to him. He explained that the relationship had merely changed from mother-son to a purely business arrangement, but without any animosity. So, as for potential witnesses to this murder, only a commission of investigation now can compel people to come forward and say what they know under oath. In an RTE documentary in 2021, they carried out a reconstruction of the crime scene in the bedroom in Flynn's house, an identical scene, with crime scene specialist Angela Doyle, forensic pathologist Dr. Ciara Staunton, state pathologist Professor Jack Crane. They gave a scathing review of the crime scene aspect of the investigation. They said, among other things, with the lapse of time from the assault to when Gardaí were called, they had time to alter the crime scene. Also, there was nothing in Richard Flynn's statement to explain blood distribution in the bedroom, including blood on the bed, clothes, and footboard on the bed. Because of the amount of blood on the floor, it was consistent with Father Molloy having been kicked by someone wearing shoes while lying on the floor, rather than from a fist. They matched this to the injury on Father Molloy's jaw, which was not consistent with being punched. This would also explain the low-level blood spatter in the room, but the testimony submitted for the trial showed Richard and Therese were in bed, in their pyjamas, so not wearing shoes. So who was wearing the shoes? The evidence the Gardaí took that night belonging to Richard Flynn did list a dressing gown, pyjamas, shoes and socks. So did Richard Flynn kick Niall? If so, he wasn't in bed if he was wearing shoes. In 2022, Father Molloy's nephew Bill Maher had gotten access to slides from Father Niall's brain. He took these to be examined by the former Northern Ireland state pathologist Professor Jack Crane. This resulted in Professor Crane concluding Father Niall had been alive following the assault, unconscious, for a number of hours. This ruled out a heart attack. Also, adequate medical attention could potentially have saved Father Niall. So was Father Niall's watch an essential piece of evidence after all? Now we need to introduce 3 new characters. Investigative journalist Veronica Guerin, the General Martin Cahill, and John Traynor. Investigative journalist Veronica Guerin was an award-winning investigative journalist. From 1994 she worked for the Irish Independent newspaper focusing on the criminal underworld and was murdered in 1996. The General, Martin Cahill, was an infamous Irish crime boss based in Dublin, known for masterminding a series of burglaries and armed robberies. His criminal activities and notoriety came to an end in August 1994 when he was shot and killed while out on bail for kidnapping charges. John Traynor was another notorious criminal. He was also a confidential source of Veronica Guerin's. So how are these 3 characters connected to Father Molloy's murder case? Well, in 1987, the General Martin Cahill broke into and stole a number of controversial files from the offices of the DPP. He did this as he could use these files to make deals with the state. This is how he worked. One of the files he stole was the file in relation to Father Molloy's death, and it appears the Gardaí got this file back, eventually in 1993, allegedly by ensuring the General's friend and notorious criminal John Traynor would have fraud charges dropped against him. So Father Niall's file was returned and the fraud charges were dropped, although the General kept copies, which were shared with Veronica Guerin. Thanks to Veronica Guerin's investigative work, we know more details about this case than we would otherwise know, as she printed in the Irish Independent at the time some of the details she had uncovered, such as the inappropriateness of Judge Rowe presiding over the case, along with letters he had written to the DPP, Eamon Barnes, multiple letters regarding this case, stating he knew both parties and supposedly insinuating the case would be looked after. This was the judge who directed the jury to find Richard Flynn not guilty. And then the General's daughter also wrote a book about her father, and included in this book, she had seen part of some of the files of Father Niall Molloy. She had spoken about the fact that the priest was hit over the head with a statue of a horse. The Flynn's neighbour, Brian Sheridan, had actually been asked to speak to Veronica Guerin regarding Father Niall's case. Unfortunately, only a week before they were supposed to meet, Veronica would be murdered. Paul Williams, a crime writer, wrote a book called The General Godfather of Crime, and in it he wrote about the stolen files, saying included in the files were documents on a number of Garda corruption cases and the file on the controversial death in 1986 of wealthy Midland priest Father Niall Molloy. Officially 145 files were stated to have been taken, but some underworld sources have since claimed the number was over 300. A commission of investigation is independent of the Gardaí. It's conducted by a retired judge at the request of a minister and with approval by a Minister for Finance. What you can do to help open a commission of investigation is simply contact your local TD. Email, letter, whatever you're most comfortable with, and let them know you want a commission of investigation into Father Niall's death. This is certainly in public interest. So guys, what do you think? It's certainly a crazy one. There are so many unanswered questions in this case. And if nothing else pointed towards a suspicious case, the fact that the file was considered so controversial that the General Martin Cahill stole it from the DPP's offices, that alone makes it an unusual set of circumstances. But then there are so many questions left unanswered, and so many people who apparently know what happened and have never come forward. We know how it goes for whistleblowers in Ireland. We saw it in the Mary Boyle case. We've seen it with bankers, with the Gardaí. Whistleblowing doesn't do well here. And it's the same for families. People don't like to tell on their own families, which is somewhat understandable, but if we don't have justice, what do we have? A commission of investigation would compel these people to speak, so it wouldn't be their fault that they had to tell. A commission of investigation is the only answer to getting justice for Father Niall Molloy, for his family, and for us all. If this is a cover-up, well then we all need to know what the real story is. Okay guys, as always, thank you so much for giving this case your much needed attention. Give the video a thumbs up, subscribe if you're not already, and I will talk to you all soon. Take care of yourselves. Good luck and bye bye.